Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Cindy Arnson, the director of the Latin American program, and I am very pleased to welcome you to today's discussion about the international dimensions of regime survival in Venezuela. A new book, which is available now on the Wilson Center website and will soon be available in print, explores the ways that the international allies of the authoritarian regime of Nicolás Maduro in Venezuela, those allies including Russia, China, Cuba, India, Turkey, and Iran, have assisted the country in surviving what is by now a calamitous economic decline, punishing US sanctions, and internal pressures for political change. This book and the authors of all of the chapters are on your screens, is the result of work that has been undertaken over close to 4 years and represents within the Wilson Center a collaboration between the Latin American program, the Kennan Institute, the Kissinger Institute for China and the United States, the Asia program, and the Middle East program. And I'd like to thank all of my Wilson Center colleagues and my Latin American program colleagues who have helped with the project over this many years. I'd also like to welcome Jennifer McCoy, Distinguished Professor of Political Science from Georgia State University, also formerly of the Carter Center in Atlanta, who will be joining me in moderating today's discussion. In characterizing Venezuela's international relations, it's difficult sometimes to distinguish between economic and security relationships. These are often intertwined and sometimes relationships that began via aid, trade, and investment can change over time to emphasize other dimensions. The examples of Russia and Cuba stand out. But for the purpose of structuring our conversation today, I'd like to distinguish between the economic dimensions of Venezuela's bilateral relationships with Russia, China, Cuba, India, Turkey, and Iran, including aspects of the illicit economy, and the dimensions that are security-oriented or geopolitical in nature. And in a final round, we'll be asking the authors to speculate on what it would take to significantly alter the calculus of Venezuela's international allies about the value to them of maintaining or modifying the relationship with the Maduro regime. I'd like to invite people who have joined us for this webinar to submit questions via Twitter to the Latin American Program's Twitter account at LATAMPROG, LATAMPROG, and we'll try to take as many of those questions as possible. We'll start with the economic relationships, the most important of which have to do with China and India, but also more recently, Turkey and Iran. So let's start with Stephen Kaplan and Michael Penfold. What can you tell us about the dimensions of China's loans and investments in Venezuela and how they have changed over time? Stephen, why don't you begin?
Thank you very much, Cindy. It's a pleasure to be here with such a terrific group of scholars, all approaching this very essential issue from a variety of perspectives, regionally and globally. So this is terrific. So in terms of China's relationship with Venezuela, if there's one takeaway lesson, I think, from it, is China's ability to learn as a creditor. I think what our chapter highlights is that China essentially made a bet early on in the case of Venezuela, and that bet went awry in many ways. What China was looking to do, essentially, from our perspective, is expand its market share in oil and energy globally, and they viewed the Venezuelan market as a key way to be able to do this. Compared to this Western risk assessment that sometimes balked at sort of political environment within Venezuela, the Chinese, particularly beginning in the global financial crisis, were quite comfortable with extending a lofty amount of financing to Venezuela. In fact, at its peak, financing to Venezuela from China reached about 2/3 of all of China's credit extended to the region. So we could ask the question, well, why? What was China trying to accomplish here? I mentioned, right, the idea of expanding market share in the energy sector, but there was also the thought where maybe they're not as sensitive to political risk initially as the West, that they could actually hedge that risk differently. So where the West oftentimes, where we see lending coming from multilateral institutions or even the market, there's an emphasis on policy conditionality, budgetary balance, maybe certain economic reforms as well. We see China, rather than having this broad macro focus in order to hedge its risk, it tends to hedge its risk with commercial conditions. And specifically in the case of Venezuela, commodity guarantees, right? Or oil for loan contracts. And so essentially they hope that they could expand market share while mitigating risk differently, commercially through these commodity guarantees. Effectively, what did China find over time? And here's the learning story. Well, as the commodity sort of boom started to dissipate in 2013, 2014, and simultaneously, Maduro took the helm, right, of sort of the political leadership within Venezuela. There started to be less faith in Venezuela's ability to navigate that economic terrain. And so we actually see China shift over time to much more of a cautious lender, where initially they were broad-based across many sectors, not only oil, but even telecommunications to agriculture. We see them increasingly only focused on investment and trying to recover, right, lost investments, particularly oil collateral that was securitizing the investment. So the story for us at the end of the day is a learning story for China as a creditor. And very importantly, what does this mean? What we see the implications of this, rather than being a debt trap, right? We often hear this meme of the debt trap where China intentionally, right, tries to get another nation indebted via cheap loans. And then there's sort of an asset grab when things go awry. We would tell a different motivational story for China, one in which they tried to expand their market share globally as an investor, mispriced their risk, and as a result, started to unwind those investment ties. So very much our story, our narrative, what we see in the China-Venezuela relationship is a country that has learned as it's grown as a creditor over time. And hence, it's very much on the sidelines, more so today than initially during the global financial crisis.
Michael Penfold, if you can unmute, can you add to that story, please?
Well, thanks, Cindy. And it's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to share with the panel and everyone who's in line our view on China's Venezuelan relationship. I just want to add very briefly three points to what just Stephen mentioned. The first being that the relationship with China started really early on, and it was one of the first attempts of Chavez to diversify its international relations away, particularly from the United States. And for China, Venezuela was a privileged entry point to Latin America at that point in the early 2000s. And I think that relationship has evolved, just as Stephen was mentioning. But I think it has also evolved in a way where China, despite the fact that privileged Venezuela with very large loans, particularly aimed at the oil and gas sector, it gradually shifted away its risk from Venezuela, particularly once they were able to get into other countries in the region. And as the crisis in Venezuela started to become more difficult, I think China was very concerned with reputational issues regarding to Venezuela. And I think in many ways, its decision to reduce its exposure to Venezuela's debt was driven not only by economic considerations. It was also driven by political considerations and trying to privilege a portfolio of investments throughout the region that were far more diversified in Brazil, in Peru, in Argentina, than in Ecuador, for example, than only in Venezuela as when they started in the early 2000s. And secondly, this behavior, I think, is interesting to observe once oil sanctions and secondary sanctions kick in 2019. With the emergence of the governance crisis around the presidency in Venezuela, and the emergence of Guaido as a figure, and also I think that's a turning point in their decision to shift the kind of international strategy towards Venezuela, because on the one hand they kept buying oil, but they did so basically being very careful in not violating international sanctions that were rolled out by the United States. And this was true because, first of all, they used that oil basically to repay debts, which was something allowed under the sanctions rules. And on the other hand, once secondary sanctions hit in August 2019, they started also buying oil, not directly, but through brokers, particularly in Malaysia and other countries. So that, I think, reveals China's decision that even though they were willing to support Venezuela, that support had a limit in itself. And finally, the other issue I want to highlight is that China has been moving also towards more of a political relationship with Venezuela, in the sense that they have been more willing to help the country, particularly under COVID-19, with supplies, medical supplies, vaccinations, rather than only exclusively through loans and oil purchases. And this is, I think, a very important shift also, because it's one where China is privileging its long-term interest in Venezuela, which is to keep the relationship going, but using different tools in order, in the short term, to support the regime through other means, and without losing sight that the real interest is in the oil sector. And in fact, this is the change that the chapter highlights, which is that at the beginning, China was willing to support Chavez, for example, financing all sorts of projects in the infrastructure, in financing state-owned enterprises in the agricultural sector. Most of these loans and these investments went wrong. Most of these projects, some of these projects, not all of them, but some of these projects were not finished. And slowly, China over time started concentrating basically its portfolio basically on oil and gas. So that's what I want to highlight. In principle, China is definitely an ally for Chavismo. But I think that it is, while they're looking at the very long-term interest in Venezuela, and they have been sort of trying to bound very well the kind of risk and tools that they're willing to use without necessarily alienating other countries, particularly the United States.
Hari, recently, India actually became the principal buyer of Venezuelan oil and an important provider of hard currency. Why and when did India become interested in Venezuelan oil, and has that changed recently? What's the recent trajectory?
Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks also to Cindy, who brought us all together and saw the vision for this project. Yes, you're right. India was by far the largest importer of Venezuelan oil in 2019 after US sanctions took effect. And last year in 2020, about 1/3 of Venezuela's oil exports went to India. Just a little bit more than that went to China in 2020. And as a result of that, India is a very big provider of hard currency, as you mentioned. So I did a little bit of digging before this, and I found that over the past 5 years, India has imported about $26 billion worth of oil from Venezuela. And all of that is just hard foreign currency. It doesn't go back to paying loans like China does, in China's case. So to put that in perspective, that's nearly double of what Russia, Turkey, Cuba, and Iran combined imported from Venezuela over the past 5 years. So this is really the reason why India is even included in this book, because it is a commercial lifeline for the Venezuelan regime. And most other analyses you'd see of Venezuela's external partners would focus mostly on the political allies, and they would exclude India. But having said that, I should emphasize that, unlike what Michael said, that China is an ideological ally to Chavismo, India is not. Yeah, India is sort of like the odd one out in this book. It is not an autocracy like the other countries we'll be discussing today, and it's not a political ally. It's just a commercial ally. And perhaps the biggest example of this is that the Indian Prime Minister has actually never met Maduro. Over the past 8 years, Maduro has not met the Indian head of government. And in fact, the last time that India's head of government met with the Venezuelan president was in 2005, when Chavez visited India. So it's been about 16 years. And that trip that Chavez took, that really laid the groundwork for what we see today between India and Venezuela. And the oil ministries between the two countries and oil companies started paying a lot more attention to each other after 2005. And today you have about 2 Indian companies, private companies, both of them, that import Venezuelan oil. One of them is called Reliance Industries, and the other is Nayara Energy, which is actually owned by Rosneft. And Reliance Industries, for instance, just a little bit after Chavez's trip, they signed a 15-year long-term supply contract with Venezuela to import about 300,000 barrels per day. Yeah, and right after that, about 3 Indian public oil companies invested about $2.5 billion in downstream oil projects in Venezuela. But today, a lot of this has changed. Although India is a very vital commercial partner for Venezuela, it's not the same the other way around. Yeah, because Venezuela is becoming quite a problematic supplier of oil due to the lower levels of production and due to the restrictions from US sanctions. So if the US eases its sanctions on Venezuela, I think, especially on the oil company, I think India will be back in business. Yeah, because at the end of the day, regardless of which regime is in power in Venezuela and in India, they will continue to trade in oil, because at the end of the day, it's just good business for both of them, nothing more.
Hari, thanks. Let's turn now to James Bosworth and to Imdat Oner to characterize the relationships with Turkey and Iran, both in terms of defying US sanctions, also the overlap with the illicit economies. It's a relationship that perhaps is a hinge towards thinking about the security issues that we'll touch on in a moment, because it's economic and ideological. So let's start with Imdat and the relationship between Turkey. Turkey has helped Venezuela turn its gold reserves into cash. Both countries have defied US sanctions to ship gasoline and diesel in the case of Iran, and to help market Venezuelan oil. So how would you characterize the importance of these relationships in overcoming the effects of US sanctions? Imdat, we'll start with you.
Mm-hmm. First of all, thank you so much, Dr. Cindy and the Wilson Center for this great initiative. As you highlighted, Turkey became a very unusual partner of the Maduro regime, because Turkey is the only NATO ally here in this picture, And Turkey just became a partner after 2016, and it's very new and unprecedented. So first of all, as you mentioned, this Turkey rapidly became the linchpin for the gold trade of Maduro in the facing of lowering the decreasing the oil production, and Turkey has become the largest importer of gold from Venezuela, which is around like $900 million. And to answer your question, of course, this became a critical, it provided and extended a lifeline and financial lifeline to the Maduro administration. But I want to highlight something more critical here. And rather than just thinking this gold trade, how this gold trade benefited the senior government members, not just in Venezuela, but also in Turkey. Because we know that this gold trade has a kind of a non-transparent nature. It's quite opaque, and it's a kind of a shady business, because we don't have enough information from neither side, from neither Venezuela nor from Turkey. And there are several rumors saying that Turkey officially announced that Turkey suspended the gold trade after US sanctions, but some rumors saying that some private jets and the Turkish Airlines are still carrying the gold. So there are serious questions behind this business. And when we look at the nature of this business, for example, last year, the Treasury Department revealed an indictment about Alex Saab, and it indicated that Alex Saab created some, front companies in Turkey, and these companies, the Venezuela is selling the gold to Turkey, and these companies are buying the food from Turkey, which later became the part of the club program, the social food program of Maduro. And we have witnessed that there were a kind of a widespread corruptions, which the senior government members involved. And still we don't have enough information how the Turkish government involved in this process, or is there any senior government members benefited from this trade. But given the corruption records of these two countries, it's highly possible that not just is a kind of a lifeline to the country, but also the government members, because we know that the Maduro needs to still fund and provide some benefit to the senior government members to remain in power. And I think the gold trade helped him a lot in this case. And right now, for example, Turkey started another business with Venezuela and importing tons of scrap metal from Venezuela. And again, in this case, we don't have enough information which companies, which actors involved in this business. So how we can describe Turkey-Venezuela relations, I think with this non-transparency and more kind of a murky, a shared business. And this, of course, highly benefit the government members in both countries, I guess.
Boz, as you point out in your chapter, Venezuela and Iran have almost delighted in raising the worst kinds of fears among U.S. national security policymakers. But let's start with the economics and the role of Iran during the Chavez era, but more importantly, I think most recently, in helping Venezuela defy the sanctions on the oil sector, the secondary sanctions, and actually be able to market its oil. Tell us about that relationship. Yeah.
And thank you very much for the invitation to speak here today. First off, Imdat deserves a lot of credit because a couple of years ago in the Miami Herald, he wrote an op-ed discussing how Iran's experience under sanctions in the late 2000s, early 2010s, they utilized the gold trade moving through Turkey in order to evade those sanctions. And one of the things you've seen in recent years is that Iran has trained Venezuela how to evade sanctions. And so this sort of lesson as a trainer has been really important. And you've seen similar facilitators, not necessarily the exact same facilitators, but similar facilitators being used in Turkey, in the UAE. And this goes to a larger challenge that you see in this entire event today and in the book. It's not just that Venezuela is under sanctions, Russia's under sanctions, Cuba's under sanctions, the US has sanctions under China, and the US, unfortunately, in this process has created an axis of the sanctioned, we've pushed together the sanctioned countries and given them a reason to form alliances and form financial ties to create the ties that allow them to evade those sanctions. Because any individual country being sanctioned could be punished. But together they have the ability to conduct that trade and conduct those financial relationships. And what you've seen with Iran sort of drawn Venezuela into this alliance. I mean, so has Russia, so has China. And Iran has assisted Venezuela in understanding how to evade sanctions in the maritime environment, in terms of moving ships from point to point, in terms of trading oil with China. Venezuelan oil is now moving through Malaysia the same way Iranian oil is moving through Malaysia in order to go to China. And with Turkey and the gold trade, Iran helped use their facilitators in Turkey to allow Venezuela to ship the gold to Turkey. And the Turkish government, there's facilitators in Turkey that are separate from Iran that also get some credit for this. But to move gold into Turkey, providing cash flow or providing a reason for Venezuela then to be able to import things like food and diesel fuel. In 2020, as a number of other countries backed off, and some reasons for secondary sanctions, and some reasons just because we were under COVID and there were other priorities in the world, Iran became vitally important, not just in terms of training Venezuela how to evade sanctions, but helping Venezuela and being the transactional partner for Venezuela. And so you saw the gold go from Venezuela to Turkey, change to Venezuela to the UAE, and then Venezuela directly to Iran, going on flights from Venezuela to Iran. And Iran was shipping oil directly, or diesel fuel, back to Venezuela. They were also shipping parts for the refineries to Venezuela. It became a transactional relationship where Iran benefited. They were able to get gold, which they're able to use then for their own financial purposes. It gave them a partner that they were able to use to both sort of jointly evade sanctions over time. And so it's been really important for both countries, but it is a transactional relationship. I think there's this desire to see them as sort of, hey, these are the bad guys working together. And it's fun to view them that way, but Iran is getting benefits from this, and so is Venezuela. And there's a big transactional element to this. And if they weren't benefiting financially, they probably would work together far less.
Oz, thanks. Jennifer asked the next question, but I'd like to remind people that have joined the webinar, if you have a question, please submit it to our Twitter account @LatAmProg. Thank you, Jennifer.
Yes, so let's turn now to the geopolitical and strategic and security aspects of Venezuela's foreign relations. Russia has provided arms, equipment, military advisors, and at one point even sent strategic bombers to Venezuela as a warning to the then Trump administration to take military options off the table. But Russia, through its state oil company Rosneft, was until last year a major player in Venezuela's oil sector as well. So Vladimir, what are Russia's interests and motivations in Venezuela? And how would you characterize them following Rosneft's withdrawal?
Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon and good evening in India and some other places. Thank you very much for this opportunity to join everyone for this launch of this very interesting book. And thank you, Jennifer, for your question. I think there is likely no other extra hemispheric power which has similar importance for the fate of Venezuela as Russia. I think Russia's participation in the Venezuelan crisis was determined for keeping Maduro in the power, and it remains as the most important ally of Venezuela on the global scale. So I have no doubts on this. But sometimes I think the Russians' motivation to support Venezuela have been perhaps wrongly interpreted. I think, yes, there is important security implications of Russians' participation in the Venezuelan case. And Russia does look for reciprocity, but in my opinion, that reciprocity is mostly symbolic. Russia perhaps is not prepared to invest a similar amount of money as the Soviet Union did in the case of Cuba. I think Putin is not willing to sacrifice the economic wealth of Russia, which is also experienced some troubles, to save Maduro regime by any cost. But this is why the case of Russia's engagement with Venezuela is so important. I was paying closer attention to what Michael Penfold was saying and Stephen was saying about China learning from its experience in Venezuela. I think Russia did the same. For Russia, the most important value of Latin America is its geographical proximity to the United States. But it is not the new Cold War from that respect. It's not real balancing of power. It's most of all the symbolic reciprocity that Russia would like to take advantage of being visually present in Venezuela. So Russia learned a lot from its affair with Venezuela. Russian foreign policy has been very opportunistic in Venezuela, but also in some other places. And this knowledge actually is very useful for whatever Russia will be doing in the future in Latin America in general terms and in Venezuela in particular. I even use the term of Venezuelization of the Russian foreign policy in Latin America, because Russia learned to kill many birds with one stone. They actually feel very comfortable in using really a package of different tools of engagement. When it was convenient for Russia, when Russia could do this, they actually have Rosneft helping Maduro regime and providing a lifeline for Maduro during one of the most crucial period for the regime's survival. Rosneft was forced to leave Venezuela because of the UN sanctions, but actually the Russian government is still there. It would be very interesting to see what will happen actually to the Russian assets in Venezuela that will transfer very quickly to some shadow company owned entirely by the Russian government. But there are other aspects of relationships which are very important. I think there is not any other extra-hemispheric power which managed to build such level of trust and confidence at the personal level. And this is actually very interesting because it cannot pass without noticing that the Maduro regime, the key officials of the Maduro government is trying to use any opportunity to meet personally Russian counterparts, even despite of the pandemics. So this creates a kind of the environment that actually placed Russia in a very particular position in terms of what might happen in Venezuela. So I think I will stop here, but I will be ready to answer any other question that might be related to Russia in Venezuela.
Thanks, Vladimir, and we'll certainly come back to talk some more about Rosneft. Let's talk now about Cuba. There are two chapters, one co-authored by Brian Fonseca and John Polga Hasimovich, and another authored by Richard Feinberg. This relationship has strong ideological, military, and economic dimensions. Brian and John, you have focused on the security and intelligence support from Cuba to the Maduro regime. Richard, you have focused on the historical rivalries between Cuba and Venezuela for sub-regional hegemony. So I'd like to ask each of you to please define what you see as the essence of the bilateral relationship and its importance to both countries, both to Cuba and to Venezuela.
Richard, you want to go first?
Oh, okay, sure. Thank you very much. Really a fascinating discussion. Let me just begin, if I might, on a personal note, Cindy. Today is the first day at which I will be Professor Emeritus, which is to say retired from full-time teaching. So that's an important milestone. Thank you all, guys.
Congratulations, Richard, and we look forward to more written products for the Wilson Center.
I will have more time to devote to your work, Cindy. Thank you. Unlike the other countries we've been discussing, Cuba and Venezuela actually have a very, very long, deep historical relationship, of course, having been part of the same Spanish Empire for 300 years. And then if we look more recently, it's been an on and off relationship, sometimes very close, sometimes competitive. As Michael Penfold would probably recall, the Pact of Caracas was a very important step in which the various opposition forces to Batista came together behind a common, actually moderate social democratic platform that they pledged to the Cuban people. If only the Pact of Venezuela had actually been implemented by Fidel Castro, we'd be in a very different world in the Western Hemisphere. So if you just look at the map, Cuba and Venezuela would actually be natural competitors for influence in the Caribbean basin, being the two largest powers in the region, if we leave aside Mexico, which for various historical reasons has had a rather passive, timid foreign policy in the area. But then when Chavez comes to power, he poses initially is quite a different model from the Cuban model. Let's call it national populism, if you will, and then his ALBA model. And that was quite different from the Cuban model of Marxist-Leninism and at that time, the non-aligned movement. So really, ALBA and the non-aligned movement were really quite at loggerheads for influence in the region, with Venezuela and Cuba really posing different solutions to countries in the developing world and in Latin America. This changes, I would say, dramatically after the 2002 failed coup attempt against Chavez, when the Bush administration in the United States prematurely announces its support for the coup against Chavez. At that point, Chavez reassesses his international relations, defines the United States as the enemy, and therefore enters into this abrazo, this hug with the Cubans, because Cuba might not be very good when it comes to economic policy, but one thing the Cuban government has become quite adept at is security policy. As far as we know, since the regime took power in the 1960s, there has been no serious coup attempt against the dominant Politburo in the Communist Party. So Cuban security assistance became very important to Chavez in maintaining basically his control over his own security apparatus. The other thing the Cubans began to provide was very large numbers of professional technical assistants, medical teachers, etc., that Chavez inserts into the poorer areas, mostly in the major cities. And during the electoral period, when elections were still important to the Chavistas, some people think that Cuban technical assistance, large scale, was perhaps critical in winning certain elections in Venezuela. Jennifer could comment on that in greater depth, I'm sure. So basically, the relationship has been a barter relationship between the two nations, Cuba and Venezuela, in which they exchange goods and services, where they have comparative advantages and surplus. That is to say, oil on the one hand, security assistance and doctors on the other. And that economic exchange has provided important solutions to both partners in their most pressing international problems. I would just add one final point, though, that the Venezuelan oil subsidy to Cuba, which was very large and remains important, although at a reduced level, we assume, that had a certain, if you will, structural deleterious effect in that Cuba failed to transition towards more sustainable energy sources during the say last 10 or 15 years, so that Cuba remains heavily dependent upon imported oil and gas. And that's one of the reasons that the economy right now is in a deep depression. So I'll end there. Thank you all very much.
So I'll pick up, Cindy, if that's okay, and start talking about the work that John and I did And I'll tell you, this was a labor of love. John and I spent a significant amount of time really kind of digging in, and Cindy's charge to us was to move beyond speculation, really try to identify what we could concretely in terms of what the texture of the Cuba-Venezuelan relationship was. And as Richard already pointed out, sort of we focused on looking at more of the contemporary relationship that kind of blossomed out of the late 90s, largely in part of, sort of the mentor-pupil relationship that evolved between Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez. We found that sort of that affinity grew from an ideological relationship into more of a strategic partnership. And as John and I sort of conclude, something that akin today seems far more transactional, was perhaps built on an ideological foundation. But nonetheless, the ties that bind, which I think is the sort of overarching concept underwriting this conference, is as relevant as ever with respect to Cuba and Venezuela, as Cuban security officials exercise really important and significant influence in Venezuela, and provides, as Richard pointed out, the technical support to the Maduro regime. Obviously, details of the relationship, because of the security nature of it, have been really shrouded in secrecy, and this complicates the assessments of Cuba's role in Venezuela. The two governments have not been very transparent about the size and scope of any contingent of Cuban military and security forces operating in Venezuela. And in fact, Havana claims that there are no Cuban security personnel in Venezuela, but merely medical staff providing humanitarian support and humanitarian missions. At the same time, on the other side, the United States and other countries have at times exaggerated, in our opinion, exaggerated the number of Cuban security forces or intelligence forces on the ground. And I think this was one of the things that we had to delicately balance, because there is so much domestic politics in the US sort of fused into the relationship between Cuba and Venezuela, that we had to navigate sort of this issue of size and scope. And so, despite that transparency and what we think are the lack of transparency, rather, and what we sort of factor the overestimations of Cuban security professionals operating in Venezuela, we did find clear evidence of Cuban security training and technical assistance that is really, like its relationships with other governments, really sort of enabled it to build a firewall against internal and external threats, and ultimately led to regime survival. The texture of today's Cuba-Venezuela relationships remains consistent with much of the areas born out of cooperation between Chavez and Castro early on. Our findings conclude that the intensity and depth of engagement, however, has slowly faded under Presidents Raul Castro and Miguel Diaz-Canel and Maduro in Venezuela, with one notable exception, and that is security and intelligence support enabling survival of the regime. Today, the Cuba-Venezuelan relationship appears largely centered on the security and intelligence transactional aspect. Increasingly, the Cuban government has supplied Caracas with security and intelligence support that has helped it stay in power, such as deploying security personnel to protect Maduro and other members of the political elite, providing counterintelligence support to firewall against potential uprisings from within, and providing technical advice to counter opposition and internal efforts at regime change. And perhaps even more recently, and as Boz pointed out earlier, the collective knowledge that Cuba, Iran, Russia have in terms of mitigating US sanctions and the massive sanction regime that the United States has upped over the last year, there's no doubt that Cuba has provided some technical support in that area as well. And as Richard pointed out, all of this in exchange transactionally for oil and other subsidies that, again, lend to the needs of the Cuban government. And although it's been difficult to assess the numbers of Cuban security on the ground, we've been pretty clear that Cuba has a very compelling economic and political interest in Venezuela's regime survival, and thereby supporting it, again, in the security assistance space. Our chapter really covers 3 periods, and then I'll turn it over to John to kind of deepen it. We look first at sort of the first period, which is really of the ideological foundation. This is the period in which much of the bilateral agreements, came out of the Cuba-Venezuela relationship. And this is looking at the period 1999 to 2004. That's when much of the foundation of the contemporary Cuba-Venezuela relationship was laid. The second period involves sort of an increase in exchange of goods and an institutionalization and regionalization of its relationship. And it begins with rising oil prices. And as Richard pointed out, the creation of multilateral organizations that they leverage to, again, try to expand influence across the region. And then we look finally at the third stage, which is the current stage, 2013 to present, that coincides inversely with the fall in oil prices, Venezuela's economic and political crisis, and a stronger role for Cuban political, military, and intelligence advisors in Venezuela to safeguard and firewall the regime from internal and external threats. And so I'll stop there and kick it over to John to fill in the gaps.
Thank you, Richard and Brian. I'm going to be brief because you've all heard a lot about Cuba now. I would argue that Cuba was Chavista Venezuela's first ally, right? And it's probably its most enduring ally. Earlier today, right at the beginning of our conversation, Stephen said that China had made a bet that had gone awry, I think were his words, made a bet in Venezuela. I think Cuba's done the opposite. It made a bet that has been very fruitful over the past however many years now, 22 years, right? It's been wildly successful. Venezuela is a commercial lifeline for Cuba the way that India and China are commercial lifelines for Venezuela, right? And so that relationship, the essence of the relationship, as Brian says, right now is one of quid pro quo. But it's, in one sense, the death of Chavez helped this, right? The onset of Venezuela's prolonged economic crisis transformed the relationship from one that was, I think, multidimensional to one that was possibly more narrow, but much more mutually interdependent, right? We know, as Brian said, Cuba receives Venezuelan oil in order to maintain its economy, and Venezuela receives Cuban intelligence and military advisory support. So essentially that Nicolás Maduro can remain in power. Over the past couple of years, we've seen Cuban medical professionals leave the country, especially prior to the pandemic, right? Their numbers still bandied about at some 40,000 Cuban medical personnel in Venezuela. That's wildly overcounting. Right, as the economic crisis intensified, the Venezuelan government stopped funding Barrio Adentro, the mission, the health mission stopped funding Barrio Adentro to the full extent that it had before, right? That was giving Cuban medical personnel work. And Venezuela also, supposedly, if reports are correct, has not paid many of these medical workers. Venezuela's leadership and regional influence have also decreased over the past decade, or at least over the past 7 or 8 years. And so it's altered the relationship. What hasn't changed, however, is the fact that Venezuela continues to send oil to Cuba, right? You hear about it in the press that Venezuela doesn't have enough diesel, but it sends its diesel it gets from who knows where, maybe Iran, maybe somewhere else, that circumvents sanctions. And it sends that, part of that diesel, at least a third of the diesel that arrived recently, it's sent directly to Cuba, right? So for Venezuela, the relationship is centered on security and intelligence, right? Maduro and his confidants certainly rely on Cuban intelligence personnel to identify coup plotters, provide advice on managing popular unrest. And, it appears that at least some of the Venezuelan government's decisions originate with Cuban advisors as well. So I'm going to leave it at that, but I think the essence of the relationship is one of mutual dependence and definite quid pro quo.
Thank you. So we want to remind people again to send questions on Twitter to @LatAmProg, LATAMPROG. I wanted to ask 2 short follow-up questions before we move toward audience questions. One is to Hari. How has India evaded, or not evaded, but dealt with US sanctions to continue this normal trade for hard currency that you said as late as 2020 at least? I don't quite understand that. And I also want to ask if Richard or anyone knows if Venezuela is still providing the subsidized oil as well to Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, which had been critical to his survival as well. And we know that it's turning authoritarian. Thanks. Hari?
Thanks, Jennifer. That's a good question. So there are only two Indian companies, both private companies, that import oil from Venezuela. One is called Reliance Industries. It is, in fact, India's largest company. And the other is Nayara Energy, which is owned also by Rosneft. So both of them have used sort of different ways to comply with US sanctions rather than evading. So both of them have complied with US sanctions. Reliance actually has a lobbying firm in Washington, DC, that regularly lobbies with the US State Department to make sure that they comply with these sanctions. And the way they did that, at least over the last year, is by exporting diesel, from India to Venezuela in exchange for Venezuelan oil. So they don't pay hard currency. In 2020, they did not pay hard currency, I think for about 7 months or so of the year. And they continue to export diesel to Venezuela. And the other company, Nayara Energy, because they were owned by Rosneft and Russia has, multiple billions of dollars loaned to the Venezuelan regime, a lot of that was just offset through those loans. So they did not pay either. But that stopped around March, April 2020, when Rosneft had closed its interactions with PDVSA in Venezuela. But still, I'd like to emphasize that India is one of the few countries that tries to comply rather than evade these sanctions. And it's done that with Iran and continues to do that. In fact, with Iran, I think over the past 2 years, India has not imported any oil from Iran either. And these diesel swaps, for instance, were allowed under humanitarian grounds. And I have a feeling that the Biden administration may at some point decide to review or remove at least these diesel swaps, if not the entire sanctions. And that would mean that Reliance can continue this relationship. And at the end of the day, it's a highly profitable business for these companies because of the fact that heavy Venezuelan oil is not, it's not something that oil companies all over the world can afford to buy huge quantities of. Very few companies can buy it in very big quantities and still turn a big profit. And Reliance is one of those companies.
So Jennifer, on your question, Venezuela, Nicaragua, yeah, thanks. Fascinating question. Certainly we know that the various subsidies from Venezuela to Nicaragua have declined dramatically. And that's one explanation for the inability of the Ortega government to continue its previous sort of populist, responsible populism policies of providing goodies for everybody so they could maintain power more or less through democratic means. In the absence of those subsidies, they've had to resort, the government of Ortega, to more repressive measures to maintain itself in power. Different from Cuba, though, by and large, the Ortega government has run responsible economic policies, that is to say, keeping accounts balanced so that they actually sit on large foreign exchange surpluses. So they can operate on and they're not under international sanctions either. So they really can import whatever they need on a global basis using the hard currency that they do have. The economy is in recession because of the pandemic and other factors. So their import needs of Nicaragua have actually declined. And that explains why they're running surpluses. And also would explain, by the way, why they're less susceptible to various US sanctions at this point.
Thanks, everyone. I think we're going to go to a speculative area, which is not so much touched on explicitly in the book, but is hinted at, which has to do with whether it would be possible at some point, should there, for example, be progress in moving towards political negotiations within Venezuela between the opposition and the Maduro government, whether any of the countries that we have looked at would be able to play a positive role in fostering that peaceful democratic solution, or are they more poised for their own self-interest to play the role of spoilers? So why don't we go back and start with China and hear from everybody discussing these 6 countries. So Michael and Stephen, let's start with you on China.
Thank you, Cindy. I think in terms of looking at, how would China approach Venezuela moving forward, including, the potential for negotiations, we can look to a past data point in 2019, and I'm sure that Michael can expand upon this as well. But essentially, right, China was supportive of those negotiations in Norway between the opposition and the Chavista regime. So notwithstanding sort of outwardly supporting the Chavista regime, they've also kind of taken a political hedge position where they're willing to support negotiations and even made overtures at times to opposition governments, the opposition within Venezuela throughout the years. I think importantly, when we think of, how does China behave with Venezuela bilaterally, we need to think regionally as well, right? Because very much, as Michael was highlighting earlier, the entry point for China to the region was in many ways economically was Venezuela. But that being said, they now have much more of a diversified posture within the region. So when we think of China, we should think of them almost in terms of a portfolio, right? That they're going to be concerned about their investments and their relations throughout the region. So what they've done to some extent, and this is sort of a continuation of that lesson point I made earlier, is they've taken some lessons as a creditor in Venezuela and applied it elsewhere. In other words, they've diversified their instruments. So rather than solely using a state-to-state investment relationship where loans go directly to joint development projects on a government-to-government basis, they've started to use state-backed private equity funds to invest directly in companies within the region, and oftentimes in places that are more market-oriented in the region, right, such as Brazil. So we've seen this diversification of investment strategy, in part because of the lessons they've learned in China. And then simultaneously, we've seen it with debt too. They've been much more willing to restructure debt in places like Ecuador out of fear of that sort of debt trap meme, right, that comes out of DC. And out of fear what the region will sort of conclude about what it's trying to do based upon just the Venezuelan case. So we see them quite open to things like restructuring, not only in Ecuador, but elsewhere in the region as well. And then finally, in terms of instruments, we've seen them actually reduce the amount of loans to the region recently, and instead highlight and use much more frequently mass diplomacy, vaccine diplomacy, let this sort of almost straightforward soft power kind of investment take the forefront, which allows them to continue to take this political hedge in a place like Venezuela that obviously carries much more larger geopolitical implications.
Michael, and let's try
Yes,
to
and
keep
just
these
very shortly.
Yeah.
I mean, unlike Russia, China has been, I would say, a loser from the current political conflict in Venezuela and the size of the humanitarian situation. Russia is today the third provider of oil to the US, and in part, the reason for that is that they benefited enormously from Venezuela being out of the market in the US and selling oil to the refineries. And Rosneft left the country altogether. By contrast, China has stayed protecting its long-term interest in Venezuela. So I think overall, my view is that they want to see a solution to the current situation in Venezuela in order to have what they perceive an important upside in the reconstruction of the oil industry. Of course, the way how that political conflict is settled will determine what kind of role they can or cannot play in Venezuela in terms of international financing to reconstruct the oil industry. And therefore, I think, as Stephen was saying, some type of political settlement that goes through some negotiation of some sort, that they would like to see one where the outcome is some kind of coexistence between the opposition and Chavismo, rather than a displacement of Chavismo, because that would put, I think, at risk their long-term view of the oil sector. So overall, in terms of how that relationship evolves, for China, it's really contingent on the political situation and whether Venezuela is able or not to find some kind of political settlement in the near future.
Vladimir, you explicitly mention in your chapter that Russia can be helpful. Everything that you have said thus far indicates that perhaps that's not the case. Could you talk about Russia's potential role in a Venezuelan settlement?
Thank you very much, Sydney, for this question. Yes, it may seem that Russia is the only country which actually will defend Maduro till the very end. But I think this is not so much true, in the sense that Venezuela is like a suitcase without a handle for Russia. Russia has invested too much into Venezuela. And first of all, from the perspective of a symbolic reciprocity, they can't simply leave Venezuela. But they are very much aware that the cost of keeping Maduro government will be each time higher and higher for Russia. So I think they will be willing to negotiate a possibility that some other type of a government will take place of Maduro in Venezuela. And actually, each time when Russian officials are meeting Maduro's official, they do talk about the possibility of some kind of a political settlement. The fact is that we do not pay too much attention to this, but I think this has been a kind of a message of Russia. Let's see what can be offered to us, so we will be willing to negotiate. And after all, I think for Vladimir Putin, the Venezuelan case is one of the assets. He believes that it's one of the assets that he can actually negotiate with the United States. Putin is suffering because of the isolation. This isolation apparently has been actually changing, especially taking into account the results of the summit between Biden and Putin in Geneva recent. So I think Venezuela can be one of those cases that Russia will be willing to negotiate. It's just too costly for Russia to maintain the Maduro regime, so they might be willing to negotiate, and this is actually a good thing for us.
Let's go to Cuba, and then we'll take Iran, Turkey, and India.
So thank you, Cindy. So I think this has been a fascinating conversation because this helps to explain why these various autocratic regimes worldwide have been able to endure in power much longer than we may have anticipated. And this has to do with, among other reasons, despite US sanctions and other diplomatic efforts to unseat these regimes, it has to do with, it's a more pluralistic world. Countries have their own interests. They're not necessarily willing to line up with the United States, and they support each other. They learn from each other, and they're willing to share security capabilities. And the ability of these regimes to use IT and other methods to maintain command and control of the security apparatus, as well as to track opponents to the regime, is also something they have in common. Furthermore, as pointed out with regard to sort of corruption, as some of our speakers have mentioned, these regimes have been able to keep their supporters together, partly through corrupt activities that they have access to through these regimes. So all of these factors explain why regimes from Nicaragua to Myanmar to Belarus to Venezuela have been able to maintain themselves more longer and under sanctions than we might have anticipated. Now, specifically with the case of the United States and Venezuela, of course, we have driven Cuba and Venezuela closer and closer together because we put them in the same box and we are very antagonistic to both. Now, a way out, of course, would be to say to the Cubans, okay, we'd like you to withdraw some of your security support or threaten to do so as part of a negotiated settlement. And that, however, we, the United States, the international community, are willing to step in and substitute for those large Venezuelan subsidies, particularly in the oil sector. Now, that would require, of course, a completely different approach to Cuba than Trump took. And so far, to everybody's sort of surprise, Biden has not fulfilled his campaign promises, and he's maintained a very hostile, although quieter, but still hostile attitude towards Cuba, driven presumably mostly by domestic U.S. politics. Now, suppose Biden were to say to the Cubans, look, let's cut a deal here. We will help you out a little bit. We'll reduce our sanctions if you participate in a constructive way on negotiations with Venezuela, which is what I would advocate. However, one does have to be realistic here. If you're sitting in Havana, how good is any pledge from a U.S. government at this point? Governments change with dizzying speed in Washington these days, and the ability of Biden to keep on track any policy towards Cuba, given the evident influence of certain congressional, well-placed members of Congress, including Democrats, given the concern over domestic politics in Florida, the reliability, the credibility of the United States from the Havana perspective, has to be seen as rather thin. So I would still advocate that the U.S. ought to try a more subtle policy of dividing Cuba from Venezuela, while recognizing that that's not going to be an easy diplomatic maneuver. Thank you.
And to pick up on what Richard just said, I think Cuba has the potential to be a very important player in the search for a peaceful resolution. I think possibly my perspective is a little more optimistic. We know that there are antecedents for this, right? Cuba was a facilitator in negotiations between the FARC and the Santos government in Colombia, right? I think obviously the likelihood of this in Venezuela's case is a function of Venezuela's own political and economic stability and its ability to continue to provide oil for Cuba, right? A hypothetical demise of Maduro or of Chavismo would have a significant impact on Cuba, right? And plunge it into another special period. So it's important to understand what are the conditions in Venezuela, domestic economic and political conditions that could drive Cuba towards wanting to participate and wanting to facilitate or not. Above all else, we know that the Cuban regime wants to protect its revolution. Are there assurances, as Richard rightfully points out, that this would happen if Cuba were able to facilitate dialogue? In the end, yes, it could play a constructive accompanying role as long as that doesn't pose an existential threat to its own survival.
I just want to add briefly two things that I think have already been touched on, but I want to deepen it. One, I have the privilege of sitting just a few minutes away from both Little Havana and West Venezuela, two really influential diaspora communities down here in South Florida. And I think that to Richard and John's point, I appreciate the optimism, but I'll tell you that the domestic political pressure will be, to steal Vladimir's term, a heavy suitcase without a handle, right? Maybe, but I think that domestic political pressure is going to continue to give Washington a lot of difficulty in terms of how it navigates its foreign policy. That's number one. Number two, something that Richard said that I've been hearing out of Washington circles lately is that policymakers have lumped Cuba and Venezuela in sort of the same category as socialist Latin American countries, sort of on the brunt end of American foreign policy. And when you look at sort of the U.S. policy towards Cuba, despite an utter failure after 6+ decades, the fallout to U.S. national security hasn't been so overwhelming that we've learned lessons in terms of how we approach Venezuela. And so that may be telling, and again, I heard this from some folks in DC, that bad policy towards Venezuela may not have, the kind of negative impact to U.S. national security, and may not be, something to overcome vis-a-vis the domestic political costs. And so those two things are going to be very difficult to reconcile as you think about, Cuba as a potential instrument to rapprochement with Venezuela.
Excuse me, Boz, you're next.
Sure. So the short answer here there's nothing that will ever happen that will make Washington view the Iran-Venezuela relationship positive, and they're never going to see a positive take on this. But can we make it a little less negative? The potential is yes. And to that end, one of the issues here is that we have a lot of sanctions right now. We have sanctions on Venezuela for drug trafficking, human rights abuses. We want to see Maduro's regime change. We want we have issues with how the gold trade is conducted in terms of abuses in the gold zone. On Iran, there's the nuclear program, the missile program, financing for Hezbollah. You could go on and on. There's all these different sanctions, and we're never going to manage to accomplish all of it. And Washington has to decide what it wants on this front. And to that end, Iran definitely views its relationship with Venezuela as leverage in its current negotiations in Geneva to re-implement the JCPOA. And Washington has to understand that it may have to give something on one end to get something on the other. And if the priority is going to be the nuclear program in Iran, we're not necessarily going to get what we want on the Venezuela-Iran relationship. And that's unfortunate. And understanding that we're going to potentially lose on that point lets us make the right concessions and do the right negotiation. You can't do everything with sanctions. It just doesn't work. And so the way to do this correctly is to pick and choose the one or two things that we really want to accomplish, whether that's better elections later this year in Venezuela or the nuclear negotiations with Iran, and get those done rather than try to do everything.
Imdat, can Turkey play a constructive role?
Yeah, surprisingly, Turkey took significant steps towards this negotiations. If you remember last year, just before the elections in August, Turkish foreign minister announced a dialogue process between the Venezuelan opposition and the Maduro regime. And because Maduro administration several times offered Turkey to play a mediator role between the opposition and the government, because we know that some Venezuelan opposition, Venezuelan opposition is so fragmented, and some parts believe that Turkey still play a critical role because Turkey is a NATO ally and Turkey is a US ally. And even, for example, last year, Henry Capriles shared a tweet with a photo that Erdogan is shaking hand with Trump. So he's giving some credibility to Turkey because Turkey's position in NATO and also in the transatlantic allies. But it's a kind of an over optimism that Turkey couldn't play a mediator role because the other parts of opposition, they don't trust Turkey. Turkey lost its all credibility because of all this non-transparent, lack of transparency in the relations, I guess.
And finally, Hari on India.
Thanks, Cindy. So India does not generally take sides in foreign conflicts, and this is part of India's non-alignment policy. So I don't see that starting with Venezuela. I don't think the Indian government will change the relationship right now, which is centered on oil. I think politics will continue to remain secondary. And it's because both India and Venezuela have benefited greatly by keeping the oil trade going over the past few years, precisely because the relationship is not burdened by ideology or by politics, and it's instead driven by business. So what this also means is that if we do see regime change in Venezuela at some point, India will continue to import a lot of Venezuelan oil even then. And this is not something that you may expect with the other countries that are here today, which, because of that ideological relationship, may not have the same relationship with the new Venezuelan regime. And in India's case, I think that's the real positive there.
Thanks. We'll turn to audience questions now, and I'd like to start with one from Francisco Minaldi. after Rosneft left, in quotes, Venezuela, there seems to have been little help for the Venezuelan oil sector. How do you see this evolving now that the oil price is high and it could be very lucrative? And why haven't China and Russia tested the Biden administration willingness to enforce secondary sanctions? So maybe start with Vladimir on Russia and then go to China answer.
Thank you very much for this question. It's a very interesting question. Why Russia is waiting to test Biden's capacity to react on the Venezuelan case. I think it was an explicit statement, if I'm not mistaken, by the State Department that Venezuela will not be discussed during the summit between Biden and Vladimir Putin in Geneva. And I think this is a kind of a message that perhaps Venezuela will be the case which can be actually negotiated between Russia and the United States. As I was saying earlier, I think Russia is very much interested in finding a solution from this dead end where the Russian policies are now in Venezuela in terms of the future scenarios. And Russia still keeps the Rosneft assets in Venezuela because even though Rosneft has gone and it was forced, it's one of the successes, I would say, of the US sanction in that sense. But Russian government still have these assets in Venezuela. So I think the pandemic has to do a lot with this. And now when the situation is changing, even though it's been extremely slow in Venezuela and it's much slower elsewhere in Latin America, I think we may see some new developments in the second part of this year. So I wouldn't be surprised to see those developments to take place in the second part of the year.
The second part of that question, perhaps on China, why have countries with a major stake in the Venezuelan oil sector, Russia and China, not tried to test the Biden administration by defying the secondary sanctions?
I'll start on China, perhaps. And I think from the Chinese perspective, and then Michael can follow as well. I think from the Chinese perspective, again, we should look at the Chinese in terms of their regional and global portfolio, and not forget that domestically, cases like Venezuela that have been viewed as sort of economic, right, failures to some extent, are presenting challenges to the Chinese, right? And so they want to, rather than use Venezuela as a case to sort of test the United States and test them geopolitically, their prism, as mentioned earlier, is much more the region, right? And they want to be seen in the region as a developmentally positive power. And as a result, are going to be very careful in terms of how they tread in the Venezuela case. That's even exemplified by the commercial reports, the local embassies kind of telling even their firms to tread carefully in Venezuela, right? And so rather than a case of geopolitically testing the United States, I think it's been much more of one where they're waiting on the sidelines. Yes, they want to be a part of rebuilding the oil sector in the long run. They have a commercial interest in the long run, but they also want to tread very carefully politically.
Michael, did you want to add to that?
Not really, Cindy. I'll allow others to have enough time to answer other questions.
Great, thanks. Another question from Alberto Perez about Mexico. Should Mexico be included among the current allies of Venezuela? Regimes like Mexico and Argentina, should they be seen as among the enablers? Both have been helping Venezuela evade sanctions and trade oil for food. So I think, Boz, do you want to take a crack at the Mexico question? And I'll invite others to add if they wish.
Sure, it's a great question, right? Because obviously, if you saw the recent vote against Nicaragua, not Venezuela, but you saw both Mexico and Argentina abstained from voting against the recent abuses that Maduro's committed. And in many ways, it's malign neglect, right? There was a previous relationship between Chavez and the Kirchners the last time that Cristina Kirchner was in office. Alberto Fernandez is less proactively pro-Maduro, but he certainly has not been as critical. And Argentina, having mostly withdrawn from the Lima Group and its efforts to support Guaido, has been relevant. On Mexico front, this is relevant to the Iran chapter as well, because Alex Saab, on top of working through Turkey and Iran, also worked through Mexico to conduct oil for food exchanges, and he set up a series of shell companies in Mexico in order to sort of launder money and obtain some food, though at times, they were getting clapped boxes in Venezuela, with $10 or $15 worth of food, and he was charging as much as $50 per box for those. And so he's getting all of that money and then siphoning it and giving kickbacks to his allies. In many ways for Mexico as well, though, Lopez Obrador is an isolationist. He doesn't really pay much attention to the international environment. And, it wasn't that he helped set up those sanctions evasion regimes. It was more just he failed to stop them as they were occurring, as did the Peña Nieto government previously. And to the extent, it's malign neglect. And eventually Mexico did crack down, I think more out of fear of secondary sanctions than any anger at Maduro. So in this case, they're not really allies, but they're also not doing anything to proactively help the situation. And that way, they're not the best of actors in this case.
Let me just add one word on Mexico. Mexico has basically kept an arm's length from U.S. policy on Venezuela, partly on the grounds that they thought the Chavezista regime had more staying power than the U.S. seemed to think. And it turns out that the Mexicans have been correct, actually, in their assessment of the internal political situation in Venezuela, more so than the US. Now, I think AMLO, on the one hand, yes, he very much hesitates to get involved in international affairs. On the other hand, I think if he saw a realistic international negotiating strategy that had a reasonable chance of success in Venezuela, he might see an opportunity for Mexico to shine on the international scene, as it has from time to time in other moments in inter-American relations.
Cindy?
Please go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, I think Mexico, you have to evaluate on both the political and economic front. AMLO on the political front has already said that he's willing to be the host of a political negotiations mediated by Norway, either in Cancun or Mexico City. So in a way, Mexico wants to bridge a U.S. interest and Venezuela's regime interest in trying to help to broker some kind of deal that allows both sides to reach out to a potential negotiation. But on the economic front, I mean, Mexico has been key for the regime to sustain itself by importing food. Many of the firms that have been sanctioned, the private firms that have been sanctioned, are Mexicans. So it's a combination of factors. On the one hand, they have been supportive on the trading side, particularly on the food trade. And on the other side, they're trying to help out by becoming a credible host for those negotiations, particularly for Chavismo.
Brian, I think you had an additional comment on Russia, and then we're going to turn back to everybody to make perhaps one final observation that or conclusion that you don't think has been sufficiently highlighted earlier in the conversation. Brian, please.
Yeah, thanks, Cindy. I'll be real quick. This was about the sanctions. One thing I did want to point out is I think, maybe to some degree, Russia's benefited from sanctions against Venezuela. And I think we have to take that into consideration. Just in over the last year, Russia's actually thrusted itself into sort of the top spot as as the #1 importer to the US for heavy crude. And again, I think Russia's 10 million or so barrels of export is largely benefiting from the fact that Venezuela oil is being tied up in the ground. And so again, going back to some of the brilliant comments that Vladimir made, I think there's tremendous opportunism in the fact that if you keep Venezuelan oil locked up, and by the way, Russia owns roughly in joint venture 80 billion barrels of P1 reserves in the ground. and is doing virtually nothing to lift it, because I think it benefits from keeping that oil where it's at and leveraging its export to benefit financially. And even if you sort of manage that supply and you kind of look at the price per oil, a $5 delta will give 50 plus million to Russia in terms of its revenue on oil, just by sort of having those sanctions in Venezuela. And so I'm not sure Russia's really deeply concerned about getting Venezuela out from underneath sort of the thrust of U.S. sanctions.
Okay, let's start with Hari. We'll go back and ask everybody for just a final comment.
Thanks, Cindy. Really quickly, I just want to outline a couple of immediate effects that the U.S. sanctions on specifically on Venezuela's oil company have had. So the first thing is that India and China are now the biggest markets for Venezuelan oil by far. About 2/3 or even up to 70% of Venezuela's oil exports today, well, not today, maybe till about the end of 2020, went to just India and China. And in fact, a lot of it continues to go to China, and a lot of the ships are, putting off their transponders, so we don't know exactly where they're going. But a lot of that is going to China. And besides that, there has been a shortfall in terms of Indian imports from Venezuela. And the country that has made up that shortfall, surprisingly, is the US. So today, India is buying a lot more oil from the US than it is from Venezuela. And I think this may change a little bit if the sanctions are removed, especially if the diesel swaps are allowed later on. But it's important to look at the longer picture with India, and companies like Reliance and Naira Energy will continue to work with Venezuela regardless of who's in power. So I think that's the summary for India.
Boz, on Iran.
Sure. 3 quick comments. Unfortunately, I talk fast, so I'll pull this off. First off, one of the things that you've seen here across the board, all of these things, is the sort of the secondary impact of sanctions, not secondary sanctions, but the secondary impact of sanctions. As sanctions occur, these countries adapt, and this goes for all of the countries that we're talking about. And the United States needs to have a policy that does something other than simply maintain or increase sanctions. We need to be willing to rethink sanctions. That's not just for dropping sanctions, but rethinking what they are and how they operate is really important, because these countries are adapting over time, and we are pushing them in directions that we didn't expect. The second issue is, specifically regarding Iran, there's a lot of fear when it comes to Iran. You'll hear Hezbollah brought up, and I think it's really important to sort of separate out that sort of fear that comes with, anytime we're talking about Iran, we get afraid of, the bombings in Argentina, et cetera, from what's actually occurring. And there are some really bad things that are actually occurring in terms of sanctions evasion, but it's not the worst fears, nor is it something that should be panicked over in Washington. People need to take a calm, rational view at this. And the third, obviously Alex Saab's name has come up in a couple different comments here today. We're talking big geopolitical relations, country-to-country relations, but we also have the role of super facilitators and the role of personal relationships. And those personal relationships that exist around the world are just as important as the country-to-country relationships. And we can be much more effective in taking down and in sanctioning countries when we go after those super facilitators. Taking out a few nodes in sanction evasion efforts actually pays big dividends in the sanctions efforts.
Thanks. Vladimir.
Thank you. It has been a very, very interesting discussion. I personally learned a lot of new stuff, so I would like to use this opportunity to thank everyone. I think for Russia, as well as for China, but from a different perspective, Venezuela became a kind of an entry point to Latin America. Actually, the real Russian return to Latin America began with Venezuela, and it was because Putin and Chavez understood that this kind of a relation can be mutually beneficial in terms of them keeping the power in their respective countries. So I think one of the most important outcomes of the Russian love story with Venezuela is actually that Russia is now feeling very, very comfortable everywhere in Latin America. So they can do a lot of new stuff in Latin America, and that is because of the knowledge that acquired thanks to their relationship with Venezuela.
Great. Imdat, Turkey.
Yeah, maybe I need to highlight this as I remarked in my the title of the report, that this is the alliance of convenience, that it's far from any strategic relations or far from any institutionalization between the two countries. So I think we will not see Turkey in Venezuela picture after Erdogan lost the power, because we see these relations mostly based on the Erdogan-Maduro rapprochement. So that's why this personal relations makes a lot in these relations. And once any change in one of these leaders will definitely, disappear Turkey from the Venezuela picture.
Great. Let's go to our Cuba experts. Let's see, Brian and Richard. Final remarks on Cuba.
Sure. I mean, I think that, again, Richard pointed out earlier, but one of the most important things we can do is disaggregate U.S. policy and the narrative, towards Venezuela from the narrative towards Cuba. They're two very, very different countries with very different meanings for U.S. national interest in the broader geopolitical context. And so I think we do ourselves a disservice by lumping them together under the same umbrella of American foreign policy. So I think we need to be a little bit more sophisticated in how we do that. And I'm not talking about the experts, that we have, across the U.S. government, more so along the lines of the policymakers that kind of look at this through political expediency sort of lens and don't do a service to sort of disaggregating that. But I think that's really, really important. Otherwise, I think we're going to continue to push these countries to sort of work together in order to survive. Because I think that's the one thing that binds all of these actors together, is sort of a hint of survival kind of built into the pragmatic engagement that goes across all these relationships.
So following up on Brian's comment and many of the fascinating comments on this panel today, I think what we've learned is that there are many international actors with some stake in Chavismo, although a diminished stake as compared to, say, 5 years ago. But that suggests that any international mediation effort will have to give something to Chavismo to get both support within Venezuela and internationally. Now, whether the Venezuelan opposition is willing to tolerate some sort of national coalition government, whether South Florida, as Brian has emphasized, will support the United States in such a negotiation. I think these are very tough and open questions.
Michael and Stephen, final comment, and then we're done. Stephen?
I would like to end basically mentioning the role of these allies for Chavismo and for the Maduro regime in a potential negotiation process. Already the U.S. is trying to align itself with Europe and Canada and some other Latin American countries, and I think that's a very important development. I think that at some point we need to see also these allies moving towards some kind of open public diplomacy supporting this process. Without that, I think Chavismo is going to have a very difficult time to engage in a political negotiation with only international guarantors that are basically on the Western Hemisphere. So that's a development that I'm curious to see how it's going to develop if this political negotiation does move forward. For example, what will be the role of China? What will be the role of Russia, but particularly of Cuba, which as Brian was mentioning, is tremendously invested already in Venezuela survival. So I'll leave it there, Cindy.
Thanks, Michael. Stephen, last word is yours.
Terrific. So quite often from a Washington, D.C. perspective, China is treated geopolitically and even monolithically. So I think a key point and takeaway from our chapter is that this is a power that's often incremental, often diversified in its tool set, and quite willing to change its investments towards the market and even away from the state to the extent to which it needs to. That is exemplified in the case of Venezuela, where, as mentioned earlier, from the portfolio of investments, there's been a lot of mispricing of risk. Well, China understands this. And if you even look at Chinese laws domestically and internationally, what's happened, they now want to hold the leaders of state-owned enterprises more accountable for their investments abroad, right? So I very much would like to conclude emphasizing the geoeconomic nature of this relation and not just the geopolitical nature of the relationship.
Great. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. I thank all of the participants as well as the authors of these chapters for their deep knowledge and research and efforts to collaborate in this effort. As mentioned earlier, the book is available for download on the website of the Latin American Program at wilsoncenter.org. There will also be print copies eventually. Should you request one, please send us an email. Thank you so much to everyone, to our AV team, to Oscar Cruz of the Latin American Program. We're now ended. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Cindy.